grade anything during the quarter. I'll talk a little bit later about how we assess them. But I go through and leave 1 to 2 comments, some good things that they've done, but also something that I wanted to see them work on the next time around in their prep. And so I'll leave those comments. Okay? Then I go through, I have a spreadsheet where I keep all of my notes, and while I'm waiting for the next student's paragraphs to load, I'll add just kind of a shorthand version of what I put in my spreadsheet so that I have records of that there. Okay? And I also add notes on their contributions that they made to the discussions as well. Okay? Then, since I'm not grading these, I copy and paste my notes, the shortened version of those, into our online gradebook. So that's what parents see, is they see feedback on that students have received, both about the discussion itself and then also the prep that they did ahead of time. And then my last step then is to type up the notes from the discussion itself. Okay? And I add, if I come across some things in students' prep that maybe they didn't share during the discussion, I'll add that in. I don't always have time to do that, but I try to as much as possible. And then if there's any of my own ideas that I want to add and talk about when we read through these notes, I'll sometimes add those into it as well. And then the final, what kind of completes that cycle of a discussion, is then on Monday when they come in, we'll add those notes that I typed up to their handbooks, where they keep all our writing and reading mini lesson notes throughout the year. They'll tape them in, we'll read through them, we'll talk about them. If there's anything we need to discuss more, we'll follow up on that. I try to keep track, if I add anything that didn't come up during the discussion, keep track of whose paragraph that came from, so that I can ask them maybe to talk a little bit more about that. And then we repeat the cycle. Only now, when they go back, I'll ask them to review whatever feedback they got the previous week, so they can try to do that as they write the next time. All of their paragraphs, they use the same document all the time for it. It's a Google Doc, and so they can see the comment and they're going to write the next paragraph right above that. And so ask them to review that feedback and try to make use of that as you write your next ones. All right, for their prep itself, they write a paragraph that has kind of 4 parts. Okay? Their opinion statement, okay? And in this, they also include the title and the author of the book that's being written about. You can see, sorry, I'm used to my smartboard at home. So one of the papers that is in your packet is just a couple of sample paragraphs. We won't read them all through, but I mean, you're welcome to look through them, of course. So one of them is from our last discussion of the year, where we talk about what makes books memorable, and they talk about 1 or 2 of the most memorable books that they read during the year. And so you can see one student's response to that. And then a second one is also from one of our 4th quarter discussions, where we talk about how books affect us emotionally when we read them. So you can see another example from that prep as well. The paragraphs have these parts. So there's the opinion statement, which includes the title and the author, with the book being written about, along with whatever their opinion is on that question we're talking about. Their ideas and their reasons to support that, or to kind of explain that opinion. So in the case of like the most memorable book, these would be the things about that book that made it memorable. And then with that is their examples and the evidence from the book that correspond to those. And these can kind of go in any order. Like sometimes they'll explain, one idea or reason, and then the examples to go along with it. Okay. Other times they might wait and do this part in their part of their concluding statement. I give them a few phrases, and they can use other ones, but these are some. And so they can use like, this shows that, and then kind of get into some of their reasons and ideas as well. So I don't really care about the order as much, but these are the different parts of the paragraph. Alright, these are our 6 rules then for our roundtable discussions. And, I'm not going to read over all of them, but I'll highlight a couple of them. Numbers 2 and 3 and 6, I would say, are the ones that I have to remind students of the most often. Okay? Number 2 is incredible. Like, this is one of the things I learned is how important this is. Because it saves the discussion from being just like hypothetical, like, well, I think this might be the case. I've never, and I'll ask them sometime if they don't, do you have an example of this? And sometimes they say no, and so then it's just like, well, they're just kind of guessing if that's the case, that they don't actually know if this is true or not. And so I'll remind them of this a lot. It's one of the things, like, there'll be times during the discussion when I don't say anything for a long time, but that is one of the things I'll sometimes step in and just say, like, hey, do you have an example of that before we move on to the next person who's sharing? Something else that is a challenge early in the year, and they get a lot better at this as the year goes on, but is connecting what they're sharing to stuff that other people have shared as well. And so that's something, again, that I don't usually during the discussion, but beforehand, I'll emphasize, remind them to try to do that, because they might be, they're talking about a completely different book, and maybe it's even a different idea, but it's oftentimes similar in some way to something that somebody else has shared. And this is what makes it a discussion and not 20 different people just going around and sharing a different idea. And then lastly, number 6, okay, which is an issue for students for different reasons. There are some students who, every other person, their hands up and they want to share something else. Okay? There's others who are very hesitant, and so it's something, again, to remind all of them of this, that if you've already shared a couple times, okay, there's some people who, yes, you get called on by a student who just got done speaking, but at the same time, there's other kids who they need a couple seconds to okay, I'm going to share this time. And so if you're putting your hand up immediately every time, and if you're the person calling on them, and you call on them right away again, then there's 5 people who dominate the discussion. And so that's something that we remind a lot, and I'll even sometimes just stop and remind them, hey, remember, pay attention to who's already spoken, and make sure you're being aware of that as you call on them. So my role during the discussion then is I do kind of facilitate. There will be times when I'll step in and summarize something that somebody shared, and also sometimes ask them a follow-up question, or just, hey, could you explain that again? There are times when, like I said, I don't say anything for a long time, but then there's other times where students need a little nudge, or they'll share something and I know there's kind of more behind that's a really good idea, and so they need a little bit of a nudge to kind of share that. And so I will step in sometimes to do that. And I'll also ask questions to the whole class sometimes during the discussion as well. Okay? I also fill out 2 things while this is going on. It's all on the same sheet, but I'll fill out a discussion sheet with notes on the students as they're sharing, and then I also take notes. I'm the one who takes all the notes on the discussion. And so you have a copy. You have a copy in your packet of 2 things. One is a blank copy of this form, which is up here. And this is one that I've revised, so it looks, if you look at the one that's filled out already, that's from a discussion last year. I've changed some things on this, so it won't look exactly the same, but this will be my sheet for this year. Okay, has the rules at the top, and then just a number of different columns where I keep track of things that students share. These are all just tallies here, but then I added, halfway through last year, I added this space right here, mostly for, I type up reports at the end of the quarter with notes that I send to parents on a bunch of different things. And so that space is so I can take a few more detailed notes just on some of their contributions, so I can notice the types of things maybe they're sharing about, and stuff like that. And then this is my space over here then, where I record them the actual notes of what they're talking about. And so that loose sheet of paper that some of you have with the notes on effective endings, I think is the one I picked on the right. Those are all the things that I recorded over here during the discussion and then typed up. Okay? Now, students also have a sheet like this, but it's a little bit different than mine. Okay? And how they fill out parts of it are a little bit different too. But so their role in the discussion is, of course, first of all, to prepare for it with their ideas, like their paragraphs, so that they're prepared to speak when they come in. Okay? To contribute to the discussion, to be able to share, to build on things other people shared, to ask each other questions and things like that. Okay? Their job, after they get done commenting, they're the one who calls on the next person to speak then, and so that's where they have this sheet in front of them. They have to pay attention to who's already shared. And then they fill out this discussion sheet, which it's very similar to mine, but the columns there's not as many, and they're a little bit different as well. So they just are keeping track of who has shared, or if they've shared, and they'll tally those. They mark these for just anybody that they think had just a really great insight, that something they had never thought about before, just a really good idea that somebody shared, and they'll tally there. And then also anybody who asked a question, just a couple of different types of contributions. And then in the notes over here, they're not recording notes on the whole discussion like I am, but I asked them to record at least 5 things during the discussion. Ideas they really liked or agreed with, things maybe they disagreed with, and they just take notes on those in that space over there. And then there's also room at the bottom where they will give feedback, okay, on, my notes not all on the same sheet for some reason, but they'll give feedback on the discussion, both positives of the class and then things that they think as a class we can work on as well. All right. Now some of these things have come up, so I'll kind of skip over some of this, but in terms of how the discussions actually work, when they come into class, they'll arrange their desks in a U-shape usually in our room, or a circle, something like that. And they'll make sure that they turn their prep in on Google Classroom, which means they can't edit it anymore. If they didn't finish the paragraph, they can always unsubmit it afterwards and finish it up. But I want to make sure that they can't change things so that they're not messing around on their computer. They have no reason to be messing around on their computer. They just leave it open so they can see their paragraphs and look at them if they need to during the discussion. Then I hand out the discussion sheets so they can fill them out as we go. Okay? I'll get it started by calling on the next speaker, but then like I talked about, whoever that person is, they'll share whatever they want to start with, and they will call on whoever's going to speak next. They will pick them, and they can use their tally. Sometimes you'll see students who they'll look around, there's several hands up, and so they'll look down at their sheet, review who's already shared, who hasn't gotten a chance yet, and so they use that to kind of help them decide who to call on next. Okay? As I said, I'll step in as needed sometimes to clarify something, ask for further explanation, something like that, and we all are taking notes as we talk about all these. Okay? Afterwards then, to wrap them up, they will add their feedback. I'll ask a few students to kind of share some of their observations from the discussion. And at that point then, we're finished. We'll move into, they'll pull their books out and start reading for the remainder of the class time that day. Now, before I get into this, I guess, is there any, just in terms of how the discussions work, any questions or comments, thoughts?
What do you do when it turns into, I'm sharing mine, when it turns into sort of the popcorn of going around the room? Like, what have you learned to facilitate it to become more discussion like at that point?
I will say, a lot of times, a lot of them start that way. So I don't worry about it too much at the beginning because it will, not always, but there are a number of discussions that it will kind of start that way. If it keeps going that way for too long, then maybe I'll step in, or even sometimes like just mention like, hey, like this is kind of similar, like I'll kind of make the connection that they didn't make. Like, hey, this is kind of like what this person shared so that they can hear that and see that. But I will say it often does start that way. But then usually all it takes is once that first person or two kind of begins to build on something that somebody else has said, then it kind of goes and it usually takes off from there. And then you'll even have students who will say like, they'll kind of say like, hey, this isn't related to what we were just talking about, but they kind of take it in a new direction. But yeah, I think part of it is just helping them to see the connections that they're missing, and also know, like at the beginning of the year, there are some that a lot of the discussion is more that way, and I'm okay with that early on, because they do get a lot better just on their own as we talk about. They'll get a lot better as the year goes on at kind of making some of those connections, and beginning to ask more questions of each other too, which helps with that as well. So, yes.
Do you ever have the students go back and revise their initial thinking or their initial preparation?
Not in the standpoint of like rewriting the whole thing, but I will sometimes follow up with them to talk through. Especially like that's actually one of the things up here is last year I did not do this, and I have like in my spreadsheet I would have notes on this. But next year I want to have just a list on my clipboard where I keep track of like what they're reading, what page they're on. A page where I keep a list of students who, for one reason or another, sometimes I can tell when I read their paragraph, okay, they didn't quite understand like the concept we were discussing, or it could be other things too. But a list that I'll go back and okay, I want to follow up with them in a conference as they're reading that day. In terms of like if they left out parts of their paragraph, because they're going to be doing it the next week right away. Like their letter essays, they do go back to those and make changes to them. But in these, it'll just be something I'll say, hey, you didn't do this rule here, but next week, okay, that's the thing you're focusing on now, is trying to do that. So.
Or like when I said revision, do you ever ask them like, has your thinking changed because of our class discussion?
Yes, yeah, that is something that we'll talk about a little bit. Sometimes we'll talk about that on like the Monday when we read through the notes. Other times, they'll come up during I'll have them like in the bottom right corner of their sheet sometimes respond to things down there that they're left over. I'll say as you're asking, I probably don't do that consistently enough for all of their discussions, but sometimes we will talk about that kind of thing, yeah.
I don't know if you're going to get into this more, but like what does the initial mini lesson look like when you're introducing the topic for the first time?
Yeah,